Thank you very much for once again just having a chance to chat. My name is Reverend Peter Ross. I was originally born in New Jersey in the Assemblies of God's Church. It's a very conservative, charismatic church, born there in the late 70s. So it was an interesting upbringing for myself. My grandmother was one of the founding members of our church. My father was a deacon and did a lot of other aspects of the church. And so church life was just always a part of the weekly experience. And having the opportunity to also just have a number of very intelligent, scholarly individuals in my life, I began to learn a lot of scripture, and I also had the opportunity to do a lot of world travel. And I've been to 81 countries, some of them for pleasure and just learning and travel experience, but some were also, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, more scholarly. I had the opportunity to do some archaeological work in the Middle East, and that really began to stretch my understanding of the world even more. And not just of the world, but of scripture itself, because I was starting to dig into the actual places where scripture is talking about. Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and then attending college and seminary and really kind of getting a deeper understanding of the foundations of Christianity, its origins, its transmissions, learning how we begin to understand the Bible, how it was compiled from the very beginning, how it's changed over time, and how our interpretations have changed over time. That began to, once again, resurface some of these questions. And then graduating with a master's in theological studies and doing a very strong study of the biblical cultures, especially the ones that I had helped dig up in the 80s and 90s. I saw how our theology often teaches us how to read the Bible, as opposed to how the Bible informs our theology. And it began to really make me consider that this was a backwards type of thinking. A lot of the church tradition has been just to control and to create a box to put our thoughts and ourselves into so we can conform rather than be transformed. It would still be a while before the realization of that knowledge began to break through and it could not be contained anymore. When I was a professor of theological studies over at the Assemblies of God Night School in New Jersey, starting in 2010, teaching the lessons to my students, a lot of those questions I needed to really delve into first before I could begin to feel comfortable as their professor. And a few other things were beginning to happen at that time as well. A young man by the name of Tyler Clementi committed suicide in September of 2010. And his older brother, James, was a friend of mine. And the reason why Tyler committed suicide is he had been bullied at Rutgers University while he was having a relationship with another man. And that had been broadcast on the internet, and that kind of devastated him. And growing up in another Assemblies of God's church, Tyler had been rejected by his family and by his church for his sexuality. And now, kind of at the end of his rope, he found no place to get solace or comfort. And so I jumped off the George Washington Bridge. And working with James through the next several months as he was grieving the loss of his brother, that also forced me to confront my own sexuality. And when we talk about passages like the clobber passages, almost inevitably somebody's going to bring up the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And here's a clear example of those bad homosexuals getting their comeuppance from God, is kind of the mentality a lot of people have. Because when we read it, two angels are visiting the city, and all of the men of the town come together and they're banging on Lot's door to demand to have sex with the men that he has inside. And so Lot offers his daughters to the crowd, and the crowd doesn't like that. And so the angels come out and they blind the men, and then the next day the city is destroyed by fire. When we read in Ezekiel, there's a passage in chapter 49, I want to say, where it specifically says, and this was the sin of Sodom. And it basically says that the sin of Sodom was the inhospitability of the people to their neighbors. And it was the pride, the arrogance, and the brutality that they exhibited on the visitor, not that they were gay. The whole idea of Sodom and Gomorrah being an anti-gay story comes to us in around 1090. Anselm, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, has an agenda, a political agenda, to make homosexuality illegal. He's already successfully passed ecclesiastical laws, but he's writing to Henry, who is King of England, because he was the Archbishop of England, and he wants Henry to make homosexuality criminal across the country. And he cites the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and coins the term sodomy to relate to a sexual act that is not procreative. And that's the first time in the English language that sodomy has this meaning to it. And so that colors the whole interpretation of the reading of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah for the rest of our history. I began to need to finally delve into those questions of what exactly does the Bible say? How does it describe what we are to be, how we are to be? And so I still believe that Scripture is a very important aspect of our faith tradition, that it has a number of wonderful and very important models for us to emulate and rules to live by, but not so much in the way that a lot of the traditional churches teach, that you have to conform to these sets of do's and do nots. Rather, as I read Scripture, passages from like Jeremiah come to mind, where God is calling on the people to have a heart after him, to live out the law in their day-to-day lives, and not just the 613 rules, but what the core of the law is. And I think Christ gives us the best understanding for what the law really is. And he boils it down to two. And it's loving God with our whole body, mind, spirit, heart, and loving one another as ourselves. Love is the core of all of the law and the prophets. And as I began to also do more study, I realized passages from like Paul in Galatians, where he's talking about how we need to stop living under the strictures of the law and live under grace. And if we try and fit the law into our lives, we cease to be under grace. That began to really reverberate in me, and came back to those questions of, what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a follower of Christ? What does it mean to understand Scripture? And we see, I think, that the important aspects is living a life in relationship with others. When we begin to understand the Bible in that context, the Bible as it's trying to teach us to live out that fruit of the Spirit of love and joy and all of the other 9, that impacts how we then can interpret the Bible. We can look at the Scriptures to either understand them in terms of these were passages that were being written by people thousands of years ago in a very different cultural world, in a very hostile environment, between living out in a desert land, surrounded by other people with a very scarce supply of resources. And so you start to see a lot of Scripture reflecting kind of this protecting your own. The Jewish people needed to be separate and be apart from everyone else. And so a lot of the food laws and a lot of the clothing laws reflects that, but also a lot of the laws on how they were to relate to the religious practices of those nearby. And most of the sexual ethic laws reflect that. The Jews trying to be sexually pure apart from their surrounding culture. And when I was doing some of my archaeology and beginning to discover what the fertility gods of Asherah and so many of the others of that era were like, and some of the religious practices that were being done, it began to show me how Scripture has kind of shifted in how we understand it from the way that the original people would have understood it. And so when we look at, say, the 6 passages that most people will cite to be against homosexuality, most of them derive out of Leviticus. And Leviticus is an interesting book because it's written for the priesthood, not necessarily for the congregation. We had different lives back then. And a priest in Israel at that time was exclusively male. And so a lot of the language was very masculine oriented because that was just the people that it was being addressed to. Whereas other books like Deuteronomy, that's the law book for the common people, the non-priesthood. And we'll see as you read through Deuteronomy and Leviticus, there are some parallel passages that talk about, sexual ethics for the priesthood and sexual ethics for the common person, and they overlap, except in the passage talking about homosexuality. And Leviticus has really one passage and then a second passage that relates to the punishment that would be done to that person. And most people will translate that passage out of Leviticus as a man should not lay with a man, it is an abomination. And then the punishment later on is they would be put to death. And that seems very cut and dry. And the language doesn't seem to have much wiggle room. But then we begin to apply proper study of Scripture, and we begin to realize that no, there is a vast difference in that. One, the language is masculine, again, for the priesthood, and also only exclusively for the priesthood, because Deuteronomy doesn't have this passage. It ignores this sexual relationship between men, which is weird, because if God really cared about homosexuality as an abomination, you would think that there would be more reference to it, but there isn't. Another thing that we begin to realize is a lot of the other passages of Scripture that relate back to this concept phrase it not so much as a man lying with a man, but more in the context of ritual practices in the temple. And that starts to make sense that if we're talking about priesthood, okay, they're not to have sexual relations in the temple, specifically with other men. Why? Well, digging around in the Middle East, I discovered that the ancients had a particular way of looking at the world, and it was colored by two different types of magic. You had the masculine magic, or the anima, and the feminine, or the animus. And their whole cycle of life was based on trying to understand how to balance out the masculine and the feminine magics so that nature would be in balance and could reproduce. And so they would have festivals like May Day, the 1st of May, where you would do ritual sexual magic in order to create enough magic in the air so that life would grow and spring would come and the animals would reproduce and the grain would grow and people would have children and life would go on. But occasionally they thought that there was sometimes too much feminine magic or sometimes too much masculine magic in the world, and that would need to be balanced out by doing ritual magic of just women with women and just men with men. And so that's where the priesthood would occasionally have relationships with men or women, specifically based off of that concept of trying to balance out the magic. And in Israel, where the priesthood was exclusively male, there was no need to talk about women with women because that didn't happen. And so this idea of God trying to, or at least the Israelites thinking that God wanted them to be sexually pure and sexually sacred and apart, included some of this relationship with the sexual magic of their time. And we read in passages like in Kings, where it's starting to talk about the sacred male prostitutes are being expelled from Israel during their times of, you know, religious fervor. And now we begin to understand Leviticus is talking about something apart from the day-to-day relationships between normal people. It's also interesting in the law of Israel, the way that they thought they would have a particular cinch word to their passages, a way to describe what was going on so that people could understand, okay, this law is specifically talking about honor. This law is talking about, dishonor. This law is talking about, so on and so forth. When we read in that passage of Leviticus, there's a few other passages surrounding it. Most of Leviticus 18 is talking about sexual relationships, except there's one part where it breaks off and it says, you should not give your children unto Moloch. That makes sense. But that's the whole sentence. There's no key words to understand why giving your children unto Moloch is a bad thing. And then we read the next passage, and then it says, and a man should not lie with a man, it is an abomination. Then we begin to realize, oh, as these laws were being compiled, they were originally without chapter and verse. And so whole sentences would be linked together, and sometimes multiple sentences would be linked into a small paragraph, which we call a pericope. And when the chapters and verses were added in hundreds or thousands of years later, they didn't understand necessarily the pacing of some of these and would break up the passages. So the full verse in Leviticus is, Do not give your child as a burnt offering unto Moloch, and do not lie with a man as with a woman. These are an abomination. That's the whole sentence. And with the proper understanding of the context, we can now see Leviticus is all about the sexual relations within a ritual magic practice. It has nothing to do with homosexuality. Go into the New Testament, and Paul is inventing words to kind of relate these concepts from your old Leviticus passage to the modern audience that he's writing to, who are mostly reading in Greek. And he takes the same phrase from Leviticus in Greek, arsen koitos, or man bed, and he invents a word that in most of the modern Bibles is translated as homosexual, but in all other cultures, say, for example, the Germans, and in Latin, when St. Jerome was writing it, they usually translated it as either child molester or as ritual male homosexual practice, or sacred male prostitute. Our English language got corrupted about 1,000 years ago by a guy by the name of Archbishop Anselm. He was very anti-homosexual, and he began to create certain passages to try and get the legal government of England to outlaw homosexuality. And he failed, but the writings that he created began to impact the English church. And as the English culture began to become dominant, especially after the World Wars, when England and America, two very puritanical nations that were heavily influenced by Anselm and other early writers in English, that anti-homosexuality mentality permeated how we translated scriptures. And so those passages became synonymous with anti-homosexuality, not as they originally were meant to be. So understanding the history of the Bible, we begin to realize, no, there's a big difference between how most people are reading it today and how the original cultures would have read it. And when we are reading scripture, we should not necessarily let our theology dictate, but rather let scripture and its cultural heritage tell us how to interpret it. So the day that the U.S. Supreme Court made its very famous ruling on Obergefell versus Hodges, which established marriage equality across the country, that Friday, so at that time, I had Fridays off. That was my Sabbath day because I worked throughout the weekend and Monday through Thursday at the church, as many pastors do. But of course, like most pastors, on my day off, I was at church because that weekend we were going to be having a theatrical production. I was the head of the music and creative arts department of my church, specifically for the drama side of things. So I wrote a number of productions, and that was going to be our 4th of July Patriotic Sunday. And so I had written a piece on the early founding fathers and their religious views. And that Friday, I was running cables and getting things together. And I was called into my senior pastor's office. And apparently one of the church elders had been gatekeeping and had been reading up on some of my Facebook posts. Was a little frightened that I wasn't, as firm on the gay issue that he felt I should be. And so because the Marriage Equality Act had gone through that day and throughout that weekend, a lot of the Assemblies of God's churches went through and purged anyone that they felt would be, disloyal. The language that they used was unPentecostal in their theology. So that Friday I was asked to resign, which I did. I then took some time. I came out to Michigan to visit a good friend, spend a couple weeks out here kind of getting my life back together. And that Sunday afternoon, as I was driving out to Michigan, I was taking a different way to Michigan than I normally did. I like taking Route 80 straight through Pennsylvania, straight through Ohio, and then up through Michigan as quickly as I can. But my roommate had encouraged me to maybe try Route 20, which, as I discovered, was a country lane through the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And but at the same time, that was a very divinely inspired detour, because there was a United Church of Christ church in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, that had put up about 100 pride flags across their parking lot and around their property. And I ended up pulling over and sitting in the memorial garden of that church for about an hour, just crying. For 25 years, I had not allowed myself to be gay. And that was resting in that parking lot, the opportunity where I realized God loved me as I was created. And so there was just that opportunity to worship in that parking lot for about an hour and discover who I was